In a last-ditch effort to counter China's growing influence in Africa, President Biden has decided to pay a visit to Africa. Interestingly, this would be his first and last visit to the African continent as President of the United States. While in office, President Biden has always touted the U.S. as a reliable partner in Africa, but, interestingly, he only decided to pay a visit to Africa at the end of his tenure. But why now? Or is it a matter of laying the path for Trump's administration to follow? Will Trump follow this path? Will it even make any difference in the U.S.-Africa partnership? Let's find out. Like French President Macron, Joe Biden has been emphasizing a new U.S.-Africa strategy since he assumed office. In December 2022, during the U.S.-Africa Summit, Biden promised that Africa would be a strategic focus of the U.S. political and financial commitment. Yet, Biden never found the time to visit the continent despite his promises until now that his tenure is ending. Doesn't this simply mean that Africa is not a priority for the U.S.? It certainly does. And it also means that this proposed visit is simply an attempt to counter China's influence and not a matter of the U.S. caring about Africa. How paternalistic of the U.S. Anyways, the purpose of Biden's visit is to showcase a U.S.-backed project in 3 countries that he has long pushed as a new approach to countering China's growing influence. This project is known as the Lobito Corridor Railway Redevelopment in Zambia, Congo, and Angola. The whole purpose of this project is to advance the U.S. presence in a region rich in critical minerals used in batteries for electric vehicles, electronic devices, and clean energy technologies. This is a key field in the competition between the U.S. and China, as well as the fact that China's influence in Africa has been growing steadily over the years. For years, the basis of the U.S.-Africa partnership has been in trade, security, and humanitarian aid. However, the 800-mile, $2.5 billion Lobito Corridor upgrade is a different move that takes a page out of China's Belt and Road Initiative. According to the Biden administration, the Lobito Corridor is one of Biden's signature initiatives. However, the fact is that the future of the corridor and the future of U.S.-Africa relations depend heavily on the incoming administration of President Trump. As said by Mvemba Dizolele, the director of the Africa program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a Washington-based think tank, President Biden is no longer the story. So, the question is, does the Lobito Corridor fit into Trump's vision? Before we proceed, here is a reminder to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel so that you can get more videos like this. Now, the U.S. has spent hundreds of millions of dollars on the Lobito Corridor alongside financing from the European Union, the Group of 7 leading industrialized nations, a Western-led private consortium, and African banks. For many analysts, there is hope that the Lobito project, which isn't due for completion until well after Biden has left office, will survive a change of administration and be given a chance. This is because it goes some way to blunting China, which has bipartisan backing and is high on Trump's to-do list. According to Christian Girod-Nima, who analyzes China-Africa relations, as long as they keep labeling Lobito one of the main anti-China tools in Africa, there is a certain likelihood that it's going to keep being funded. According to reports, the Lobito Corridor will be an upgrade and extension of a railway line from the copper and cobalt mines of northern Zambia and southern Congo to Angola's Atlantic Ocean port of Lobito, a route west for Africa's critical minerals. This corridor is quite important for the U.S. because China is currently dominant in mining in Zambia and Congo. In fact, Congo has more than 70% of the world's cobalt, most of which is headed to China to reinforce its critical mineral supply chain that the U.S. and Europe have to rely on. So, the corridor is a way for the U.S. to have access to these critical minerals. Interestingly, the Lobito Corridor was made possible by some American diplomatic success in Angola that led to a Western consortium winning the bid for the project in 2022 ahead of Chinese competition. This was surprising given the fact that Angola has long and strong ties with China. Following the win, the Biden administration accelerated America's outreach to Angola and somehow turned around what was an antagonistic relationship 3 decades ago when the U.S. armed anti-government rebels in Angola's civil war. Since then, trade and relations between the U.S. and Angola have steadily grown. In his visit to Angola, Biden will announce new developments on health, agribusiness, security cooperation, as well as the Libido Corridor. But the question is, will Trump follow Biden's footsteps? Well, nothing is clear because Trump is a very unpredictable leader. So, until he assumes the office of the President of the United States, we will not know if Trump would take Africa seriously or not. But whether or not the US decides to take Africa seriously, the US shouldn't forget that the choice still lies with Africa. And, unlike before when African leaders seemed to dance to the tune of the West, things have changed drastically. You see, the world is currently going through a structural transformation, and at the heart of this is the attack against the dominance of the West in the global world order. This attack is led by Russia and China and supported by several nations, particularly those in the global South, that are tired of the excesses of the West on the global stage. To push this attack is the current attempt to reduce Western influence in Africa. Africa is important for 4 reasons. 1, it is the largest regional bloc in the United Nations, representing some 28% of all the votes in the General Assembly. 2, it possesses abundant mineral resources, including some crucial raw minerals that are found only in the continent. 3, it possesses some important sea trade routes, particularly in East Africa. And fourthly, the continent is home to the fastest growing youth demographic and will account for about 42% of the world's youth by 2030. So, you can understand why every country wants to build a strong relationship with the African continent. Now, in 2022, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken said that the U.S. is the best partner for Africa, but that he will not force Africa to take sides. But from what we can see, it's obvious that the continent has chosen a side, and that side is China. Of course, the U.S. is not happy with this choice, and U.S. congressional leaders are currently considering rewriting U.S. trade policy, which would force Africa to choose between the U.S. and its main rival. But before we talk about that, let's talk about the burgeoning relationship between China and Africa and how it differs from the U.S. and Western countries' relationship with Africa. Over the past 2 decades, China has significantly expanded its investments in infrastructure projects across the African continent. This includes the construction of roads, railways, ports, and other critical infrastructure worth over $140 billion in loans. In fact, as of 2020, some 49 countries have reportedly signed agreements under China's Belt and Road Initiative. In terms of trade between China and Africa has increased from $11.67 billion in 2000 to $257.67 billion by 2022, making China the largest single trading partner for many African countries. China's increasing investment in the continent has been criticized by Western countries. According to these Western critics, China is pursuing a strategy known as debt trap diplomacy, which means providing loans to African countries for infrastructure projects that they cannot repay, allowing China to strategically control those countries' resources. Critics often cite Zambia and Uganda as examples of this situation. Zambia is heavily indebted to China, owing about $5 billion, which is about 30% of its external debt and about 20% of its GDP. However, proponents of Chinese investment in Africa argue that Chinese investment has brought significant infrastructure improvements and economic benefits to Africa. They highlight how Chinese investment has led to job creation, business opportunities, and boosted digital connectivity. For example, the railway linking Nairobi with Mombasa in Kenya is essential to boosting the local economy. Despite these advantages, critics still argue that these benefits are overshadowed by the long-term economic risks and lack of transparency of China's lending arrangements. They argue that the lending arrangements are potentially exploitative and could undermine national sovereignty and financial stability. But the question is, how is this different from the Western-controlled World Bank or IMF? In fact, there are more reports on how these institutions undermine the sovereignty and financial stability of African countries that they borrow from than China. On reflection, the China-Africa Credit and Investment Agreement has more mutual benefits than the West African Credit Agreement. Let's take a closer look at this. Since independence, the US and Europe have viewed Africa as a continent in need of assistance, and therefore have traditionally focused on providing aid and social services with a strong humanitarian focus. However, This aid and humanitarian support always comes with conditions that Western countries tout as transparency in governance and human rights. In reality, these conditions dictate to African countries how they actually run their affairs, thereby undermining their sovereignty. Typically, these aid conditions are not met by African countries, leading to delays in the disbursement of funds and, in some cases, no aid at all. This is why, in recent African Western summits, we often hear African leaders talk about how the West has consistently betrayed its financial promises to the African continent. So, when we hear Western countries promising to donate billions of dollars to Africa, we must understand that it usually ends with a conversation. There are no reciprocal actions. That is a fact. But this is not the case with China's Africa strategy. As we said earlier in this video, China is investing in Africa on a credit basis, building huge infrastructure projects such as railways, ports, and bridges as part of its Belt and Road Initiative. Unlike Western investments that are made based on political or economic conditions, Chinese investments are characterized by the absence of conditions. This obviously makes them more attractive to African leaders who are tired of the conditionality of Western aid investments. For African leaders, infrastructure development is crucial for economic growth and development, so they prefer partnerships focused on trade and economics over aid and charity. In essence, the continent's leaders are tired of being treated like beggars by Western countries that promise financial assistance in return for acquiescing to their demands. These leaders prefer to be treated as partners based on mutual interests. This idea is reflected in numerous declarations and agreements with China, prioritizing economic cooperation and infrastructure development. What is interesting is that this different strategy between China and the West did not start today. After African countries gained independence in the 1950s and 60s, Western countries provided large amounts of funding for infrastructure development across Africa through the IMF and the World Bank. The aim was to support the newly independent countries and promote economic development. These infrastructures included educational institutions, health services, and transportation networks, among others, all of which were built with Western aid. However, it is important to note that this aid and loans also came with conditions. In fact, this was arguably the beginning of the problems Africa faces today. When the World Bank gave these loans to Africa, they came with conditions known as structural adjustment programs. This neoliberal plan focused on privatization, austerity, and forced market liberalization, creating profit opportunities in favor of European multinationals, but had a devastating impact on Africa. In the 1980s and 1990s, as most African countries tried to get back on their feet after independence, these programs caused falling incomes, increasing poverty, and decades of recession and stagnation. To this day, they continue to have a negative impact on all aspects of the company. These so-called structural adjustment programs prevented the African continent from catching up, which resulted in a widening of the gap between Africa and the rest of the world. After forcing the implementation of SAPs, Western countries shifted their involvement from providing loans for infrastructure projects to providing aid, also conditional. However, China's involvement in Africa during this period was mainly characterized by ideological and possibly legal support. In the 1960s, China actively supported African countries in their struggle against imperialism and colonialism, promoting non-alignment and unity across the continent. To symbolize China's commitment to developing Africa free from colonial influences, China funded and built a railway line between Tanzania and Zambia. Now let us discuss the Western condemnation related to the types of loans offered by China that give rise to debt deals. Essentially, China offers three types of loans to Africa, none of which have political or economic strings attached. These loans include interest-free loans, preferential loans, and commercial loans, and they all serve their purpose. Interest-free loans are granted as part of the China Development Assistance Program and do not bear interest. These loans are usually used for social and humanitarian projects such as schools, hospitals, and water projects. They are like goodwill gestures, and their purpose is to strengthen diplomatic relations between China and the partner country. Concessional loans, on the other hand, are loans offered at interest rates lower than those offered in the market. These loans often have long repayment periods and are usually used for large infrastructure projects such as railways and power plants. Concessional loans are administered by China's political banks such as the Export-Import Bank of China and the China Development Bank. Commercial loans are offered at high interest rates, comparable to those offered by private banks, and are used for commercially viable projects that are expected to generate enough revenue to cover the loan costs. These loans are often brokered by Chinese commercial banks and target sectors such as mining, telecommunications, and large-scale projects. The loans may also come with other conditions in case the payment is not made on time, but this is to be expected and not a cause for concern, as China is also a sovereign country that needs to protect its investments. Interestingly, while Western countries talk about the debt trap that China has created through its loans, in 2022, China has canceled 23 loans to African countries. And according to reports, it is not unusual for China to do this. In fact, in April this year, China canceled an unspecified amount of interest-free loans to Zimbabwe and promised to help the government find a way out of its ongoing debt crisis. The question is, how much debt have Western countries forgiven African countries? Instead, we hear that countries that are already struggling with debt pay higher interest rates than Western countries when they borrow money from the World Bank. How biased is that? Considering all this, it is very clear why African countries prefer to partner with China over Western-controlled institutions. But as we have already said, the US is not happy with this decision, and US congressional leaders are now considering a rewrite of US trade policy that would force Africa to choose between the US and its main rival. The House Budget Committee on June 12th began hearings on the future of African growth and opportunity, AGOA. The hearings were accompanied by a warning that African countries that challenge US interests could be expelled. But according to former US officials, forcing Africa to choose between the US and China is a lost cause. And that is true. Because what can America offer Africa? Africa's exclusion from AGOA could have a negative impact on its economy, but it will undoubtedly rebound as it has other partners to choose from, including China and Russia. The fact is that Africa doesn't need the US or any other Western country. Africa has all it takes to survive by itself, and if it wants partners, it can decide to partner with other non-Western countries. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video.